Hello and welcome back to the Anthropology of Mediation and Images. We are here in Shonabaju and this is your lecture on immediacy. As you can see, I'm not in Edinburgh. Instead, I am in a small village in Bangladesh, about 40-50 kilometers away from the capital city, and I am here doing some field work, and that's why I can't be with you today in Edinburgh, but I'm going to give my lecture from here. And today's lecture topic is immediacy. And so we'll think about the ways in which immediacy is produced through mediation. So one of the things that I would like you to sort of think about is the ways in which me standing here in this small village allows you to participate here. Do you feel that you're right here next to me in the village? Can you hear the sounds? People talking, the birds? What can you hear when you listen beyond my voice? Can you see behind me the net in the water where people are catching fish? Can you feel the liquid warmth that's coming off the water in the winter sun here? What is it that's made present to you when you're watching this video? You can see me, you can see my surroundings, you can hear my voice. So I'm talking to you, but you're not really here. With me is Paul, who's making this video, and really I'm talking to him right now. By the time you see this, I'm not there. By the time you see this, you'll be looking at me, but I'll be doing something else. So the question that I'm really asking is here, what is it that you experience when you're watching this video? You don't really get a sense of the feeling. You don't get a sense of the warmth of the sun. You don't get a sense of touch. You don't get a sense of smell. Your hearing and vision are modulated by the technology by which this is being captured. Nonetheless, I'm there present to you. And that is because what's happening right now is that I'm being mediated. And for this lecture, I would like you to keep in mind the definition of mediation that I think I mentioned in the first lecture, which is from Samuel Weber. And he, in his book on television, produces the idea of the media, sort of definition of the media as technologies, processes and practices of mediation that are practices of mediation are those technological processes and practices by which absent objects can become present as representation. So I would like to define mediation as those practices and processes by which an absent object can become present as representation. So in this example, I am your absent object, your lecturer not in town, and I'm becoming present to you through this as a representation. So it's very distracting. There's a fish trying to escape the net right behind me, who's interrupting this seamless presentation. So in sort of classic documentary style, we can think of this as sort of, the interruption of the reel into the frame. Particular types of documentary practices are particularly invested in producing this type of immediacy of the reality right there. And a fish like this is a perfect example of that, of a sort of documentary style in which the reel is captured by a sort of non-interfering camera person or somebody getting water. So these are all these little interruptions in my seamless presentation that allows us to think about what sort of reality is being mediated here. What sort of presence is it that is created through mediation? That is the question of today's class. If and whether the media can make present something that feels real, that feels unmediated, that feels authentic. So today we'll talk about that presence, that immediacy, through a number of different examples. Now, of course, this type of presence we've come to associate in the contemporary moment with the new media, with social media, with all sorts of new digital technologies like Skype, FaceTime, Instagram, Snapchat, Facebook Live. Just looking at the names of these types of applications, of these social media, we see how they sort of promise spontaneity and immediacy, right? So Snapchat, Instagram, the instantaneity of these types of products is what's being sold here. Facebook Live, you're right there. It is almost like real life. But of course, in the same way that you're not quite here in Shonabaju, and I'm not quite there in Edinburgh, in the same way, these social media, even though they promise this sort of immediate communication, aren't quite present in the same way. So we suspect that these new media technologies aren't giving us quite access to the real thing, even though that's what they're premised on. Instagram, the instantaneous production of this older technology, the telegram, right? So it's right there with you. But we have this suspicion. We have the suspicion that even though it comes close, it isn't quite the authentic thing. So FaceTime, as a sort of the Apple technology, that the equivalent of Skype, the name relies on this idea of a face-to-face communication, right? And so that is sort of the ideal that lies behind it, the idea of face-to-face, body-to-body communication, the idea of a sort of coming together or being together that is pre-mediated. And we think of that as located in everyday life. So we have an everyday life like me here in Shonabaju. I can reach out and touch Paul in a way that I can't reach out and touch you right now. That everyday life, that sort of what they call in film studies the pro-filmic, the everyday empirical reality that comes to be mediated through the camera. That is the sort of reality that these new media technologies are trying to reproduce or to try and hint at. That's a sort of sociality in which we engage with one another in a direct way. And that type of engagement, that sense of a real social world that exists outside of the social media, that idea underlies our discontent with the ways in which social media, the internet, allows us to interact with one another. So the interactions that we have with one another over the social media are always suspect and surrounded by a discontent about its lack of similarity to the face-to-face real interactions that we have with each other offline. As a corollary to this, you can see that in the anthropologies that are being produced now of the internet and of the social media, there's always this suspicion amongst critics, amongst anthropologists, that an anthropology or an ethnography done online or over FaceTime or over Instagram or over Facebook, over WhatsApp, does that constitute proper ethnography? Is that proper fieldwork? Right? Because if you're not having that face-to-face communication that the entire mythology of anthropology's methodology is built on, then can we still call it anthropology? Can we still call it ethnography? If I have contact with my collaborators, with the people that I'm working with, only over WhatsApp, is it proper fieldwork? Is it proper anthropology? The ways in which that question is raised is indicative of the ways in which we suspect the social media from being a non-real connection to one another. Right? Does that make sense? I hope we're all following this. So it's hard now for me because I can't now ask you whether you're all understanding it, but I'm hoping that you get the point that because we think that social media are not quite the same as the everyday interactions we have with each other offline, we have this sort of suspicion of the ways in which these social media allows us to connect with one another. Now, when do we feel this sense of direct, unmediated contact? So we sometimes feel that, when we meet some kids on the street, when we're sitting together in a lecture theatre, you are sitting alongside each other in chairs, and I'm at the front babbling at you. That's a sort of immediate presence, right? Now, that is an immediate presence. A small girl running off to tell her parents the crazy things that are happening here. So when do we feel this sort of social intimacy that the social media is not able to give us? When we're finally meeting with those friends and colleagues that we haven't met for a long time, we meet them online, but when we finally get together offline, there's a sense of celebration, of joy, of intimacy. Is it when we're doing fieldwork in a place like this that we have contact with? Here also there are phone polls, there's an internet, there you can get onto WhatsApp and send a message from right here. These are types and modes of sociality that I think we have come to invest with the idea that we don't have the distance of the experience of the world around us. So when we sit together around the table and eat together, when we come and meet people face to face, those are the types of sociality, the types of engagements that we feel that there's no distance between ourselves and the world around us. Now, there are of course many ways in which we feel this lack of distance from each other, but also from ourselves. When we feel fully alive, it can be in enjoyment, it can be in grief. And for some people that may be, the real experience of bungee jumping. It may be the experience of having sex, a proper connection, physical connection with another person and with your own body. When exercising, you're pushing yourself to limit. When you're deeply immersed in the presence of a loving family, of friends. When you're tasting something extraordinary. When you're doing committed yoga. Like the ideal of the face-to-face community, this is about presence. It's about contact, about the body, and the body is central here. And that type of sense of immersion that you feel you lose when you're doing a lot of these things online, because of course we do have all sorts of social interactions online, we have sex online, we have all sorts of intimate personal relations online. We presume that they are somehow at a remove. We don't have the same experience if we were doing them in the offline world. One of the reasons why this is the case is because we presume that the body is a site of direct experience. It's a grounding site. It rests on the idea of the body as predating culture. So the body is a fount of experience and sensation that is not cultured, but rather direct. And now, when I put it like that, of course, all of you will immediately object because you've all read Bourdieu and you all know that this is a problem, that the body and its intimate experiences are in fact deeply shaped by the cultural world in which it is socialized. So what I can see, what I can't see, what I can hear, what I can't hear, what I smell, what I experience, all of that is socially patterned. And of course we have some very strong anthropological examples from it. Renate Rosaldo's article on the headhunter's grief, which I strongly recommend, is one of these early examples of showing how our very deepest emotions, and in this case grief, are in fact the outcomes of particular types of cultural frames through which we come to experience them. And what I'll do is on Learn, I'll upload a podcast that beautifully illustrates this. So I'll put that into the further listening category on Learn. The point of this is that we as anthropologists know that the body cannot really be divorced from the social and cultural world in which it is socialized. Our most basic sensations, our most intimate bodily experiences, are they therefore not quite real? Is that what anthropology teaches us? That there is a real out there, but because we have no access to it, because we're so embedded in culture, we are forever at this sort of loss that a place like the internet only just illustrates. So the body is not the fount of intimate experience that we hope it would be because we're cultured beings. And the internet is just a much more acute example of that condition. Does that make sense? I hope I'm making sense. Okay. So, is it the fact that certain experiences are mediated by cultural forms, understood in its broadest sense, does that undermine their reality? That's the question I'm asking. So now I want to sort of turn towards Matthijs van der Poort's beautiful article and take some examples from there to explore this question further. So Matthijs' article is about now I'm going to try and pronounce this properly, the Acheropoeta. Those are icons not made by the human hand. So these are sacred images that are not made with the interference of humans. That is, they are spontaneously created. They are divine. And we'll just walk a little bit this way and then we can get a sense of the types of icons that I'm talking about. So Matthijs' examples are quite beautiful. They're about the pieces of toast in which the Virgin Mary suddenly appears. We have a piece of meat that is cut to reveal the name of God. These are the types of unmediated presences of the divine that these types of icons not made by the human hand produce. So they are a form of immediate presence. Okay, I'm going to take this high step, so stay with me. So I don't know if you can see this, but here is a small temple in which we have a statue of Durga. She is one of the key gods in the Bengali forms of Hinduism, and we see her here around her, some of her companions, some of her opponents, and she has in her hands a whole series of objects, and she rides on a lion. She's incredibly popular and powerful in the part of Bengal where I am now. And in many ways, this is both the god and the representation of the god. So this is a statue that is the god, but also God can come to live within this vessel, right? So here we have the presence of the divine, which as you, at a distance from this, can immediately understand as a sort of an icon, as a symbol. You can see it as an image. But it's also properly divine presence. And that's what I want to talk about right now. So, the divine presence in a sacred image is a very interesting one. Because while these are clearly crafted, and along the roads in the area where I am now, you will see sculptors who are producing these Durga images during the celebrations of her festival, Durga Puja. And you'll see lots and lots of them, the icons being made. And they're sort of made out of clay, and they're made in huge numbers. And so they seem to be quite unsacred. And it takes a while for them to be inaugurated, for them to become this vessel of the divine. And there's all sorts of ritual practices that allow the divine to take up residence there. And those practices, of course, are cultural forms. They're forms that mediate, that allow the arrival of the divine into this image. But sometimes, as in the examples that Van der Poort gives, the presence of the human hand seems to be entirely absent. And now there's another story from this area. As you can see, I'm on fieldwork, so everything is coming together in this beautiful manner. Last week, in a village not very far from here, there is a statue of Jesus. So Bangladesh is 95% Muslim country, but it has a small Hindu and Christian minority. And given the fact there's the numbers of the population, there's still quite a presence. And so in a village not far from here, there was a sculpture of Jesus on the cross. And days after I had arrived, somebody recounted the story of this sculpture suddenly giving water. That is, from the feet of Jesus dripped a steady stream of water. And if I did not believe this, there was in fact some mobile phone footage of this. And I was shown this material, and you could see that people had flocked to the statue, and indeed water was dripping from its feet. People were bringing buckets and people were bringing bottles to get this holy water from this spontaneous appearance of water from the feet of Jesus. So what was it that was found here? I will just quote Matthijs van der Poort here, and he says, in a way, what we have here is a sort of a proof that, quote, one's imaginations do not involve human design, but are immanent to the world. So what Matthijs van der Poort argues with regard to these types of divine presences, these types of icons that are not made with the human hand, the real eruption of the divine into the world, he relies on Birgit Meyer's work to argue that all religions struggle with this sort of paradox at their heart, which is how to make present an absent divinity. right? So the divine is absent, but needs to be made present for us to be able to interact with it. Now, they need to be made present not just as representation, but as real, as truly here. And what the icons not made by the human hand, the eruption of the divine, such as in this particular case of the water dripping from the feet, is that it's not a representation that is produced here, but the true presence of the divine. Now, what is important of these sorts of examples, and you can from your own, social media consumption, come up with many, many examples of this, and there's a bunch of them in Matthijs' article. What is important to note is that what religious presence requires is the effacing or the disappearance of the process of mediation, right? It needs to be a spontaneous presence, not something that is humanly produced, right? So the water dripping from the feet is proof of the real presence of the divine because it was not produced by somebody. Now, Meyer argues that these are particular sorts of aesthetics, are particular types of aesthetics by which we understand certain objects, images, or acts to be true, to be divine presences. And this lack of human interference is one of them. But of course, this very clearly humanly constructed icon is one as well, because there's other types of frames by which people come to consume this image of Durga as a true presence of the god within the human-made object. Right? Now, of course, when I was shown this little video of Jesus and his dripping feet, there was, of course, a skeptic just there. All right, I'm just waiting for these guys to stop chatting because you can't hear me. Bhaiya, apni ek to edike jete parben. Thank you. Sorry. Okay, there's the reel. So when I was looking at this video, of course, next to me there was immediately a skeptic who said, well, of course that's not really divine water. And they immediately tried to reveal how this is not a divine object. In fact, what they immediately said was, well, it must be the humid air and the cold stone. It's winter in Bangladesh at the moment, so at night it gets quite cold, but of course the air, this being a delta, is quite wet, so you can immediately see how condensation might have produced this. Now this is, of course, what rationalists, what critics, what skeptics always do. They try to reveal the human, rational, logical element in these otherwise miraculous events, right? They try to show that holy men are not really saints, that their tricks can be understood. They draw back the curtain. They show that these are charlatans. And this is how they do their tricks, right? And of course, we can totally understand that this might have been what really happened in this small village where suddenly people were flocking to catch the water that came from Jesus' feet. But even as I was told this story, it's evident that there is another sort of aesthetic of persuasion that is being used here. This is, again, Birgit Meyer's term. So on the one hand, there is somebody who says, look at this is evidence of the divine. Well, there's somebody else who's sitting there and says, well, actually, let me tell you the facts. Let me tell you from my rational observation, my measured analysis, how I can break the spell of this divine interpretation and show you that the water is in fact just condensation. I can show you the reality of this particular phenomenon. Now, I want to just return with this example to Bruno Latour, and in your further reading for this week, you'll see that his introduction to the exhibition Iconoclasts is on there. You can download it online. It's a very interesting piece. And he suggests that facts, the objective facts of science, are equally a type of mediations that allow us to grasp as real a phenomenon that we can't quite see or truly understand. And of course he takes examples from astronomy, which is even more evidently incomprehensible to most people. Yet we believe these sort of representations to be true of something that we can't quite see and true of something that we can't quite understand. But we agree that this is true and that it's factual, and it's here that a sense of the real and the authentic is produced through a reasoning aesthetic that we then all agree with. So the point of this is to say that science is also an aesthetic that allows processes of authentication in which we come to invest and come to understand as real or true. Now, I think if you look at the climate change or the Brexit debates, you'll get a sense of how this works. So if I read the papers these days and I read about Brexit or I read about the climate change debate, and specifically if I read about any of these in conjunction with Trump or Boris Johnson, I feel exasperated. Why do I feel exasperated? I feel exasperated about the fact that others can't just see the truth, the unmediated, plain, obvious, bare reality of the situation. That even if I don't quite understand the exact numbers and calculations and legislations that have to do with the melting of the polar cap, that have to do with the exact EU legislations by which Brexit might happen, I still believe and I still think of these calculations and these sort of ideas around these things, that they are true, right? And I feel irritated, I feel unnerved by the fact that there are other people who, I think we can now quite easily see, believe the exact opposite, with equal passion, with equal conviction, and with an equal sense of being rational, objective observers of reality. That's exasperating, right? Now, I would say that these are both aesthetic formations that we are caught up in, and they communicate an unquestionable truth to us, right? So these debates, in the same way like the icon behind me, are forms of mediation. Knowledge comes to us as representation, but we experience them as fully truthful and real. Does that make sense to you? Think back to Samuel Weber's definition of mediation as processes and practices by which an absent object can come to be present as a representation. In a way, everything around us is embedded in these types of processes by which we can come to grasp the world. Think back to Bourdieu and the ways in which our bodies are already themselves steeped into these representations, the cultural forms that allow us access to the world outside of us, right? So that means that we are already embedded in particular types of aesthetic formations that we are caught up in, and they communicate to us an unquestionable truth about the world, right? So the point I'm making is that mediation allows a particular type of presence, and we can't experience the truth of the world or the truth of our own bodies without these intervening interpretive schemas, these representations, right? So an authentic experience is one where we don't question or we forget that these are mediated experiences. And the point of this is that that does not make them less valuable. It shows us that the experience of truth, of reality, of the divine needs mediation. But that mediation doesn't invalidate them. Mediations are powerful and they allow us access to that truth. Now, I want to give you an example from Mitchell's book, What Do Pictures Want?, which is on your reading list. In the introductory chapter, he gives us an example that comes from his own teaching experience. So what he wants to show is how mediating forms, so representations of all sorts, have power within them. How artifacts are fetishes, things that stand in for something else, but, as I will argue, are therefore not less powerful. Okay, so the example that he gives is that when he teaches a class on pictures, what he does in the first week is he asks all his students to bring in a photograph of their mother. He then asks who believes that pictures are powerful, that there's something that inheres in a picture that is dangerous or powerful in other ways. And I think the general assumption is that when people come into this class, they think that they have a pretty rational understanding of the real world and forms of mediation, and show that these are separate. So he asked his students, and then he says, okay, so all of those of you who think that the image is not necessarily powerful, that we don't have a fetishistic relationship to our images, he asked them to take a pair of scissors and cut out the eyes of the mother in the picture. So just think about that, right? Think about it for a second. I don't think I would want to do this with you, but think about this, what is happening here. So you take a picture of your mother, you take a pair of scissors, and you try to cut out the eyes. Now, that seems like a violent even almost terrifying and definitely unpleasant act, right? So why do we hesitate? Even though I'm sure all of you can be made to do this, why would we hesitate? Why would we feel this sort of moment of trepidation in cutting out the eyes of an image of a loved one? And I would say there's something that inheres in an image, a power, a truth of this other person. We are fetishist in this way because our only experience of the world, our experience of one another, is through fetishes, through things that stand in for those others, that make those others present to us. So this is a ruin, as you can see, a ruin of a grand house, what they call locally a Rajbari, literally the house of a king. It has, as you can see, been many, many years since somebody lived here. I would imagine this was probably populated until the early to mid 20th century, possibly belonging to a family that moved to India at partition, maybe a Hindu family. It's hard to tell, but there's something that dwells here, something that's still present here that is unmistakable. You walk in here, you feel the cool of the stones, and you can understand that the people that lived here in that time would have come in here during the hot summer days and rested and slept. It's haunted in the same way that the image we were just talking about is haunted by a presence. Mediation is the practice or the process by which an absent object comes to be present as a representation. And those representations, those forms of mediation don't only have to be the media, the mass media as we understand them. They can be architecture like this. They can be the stones that are in here. What these make present is the reality of another person, of the world around us. And this is why we continue to see iconoclasm. So I think you will all remember the Buddhas of Bamiyan, the big structures, Buddhas that were in Afghanistan, that were blown up by the Taliban, to great upset and uproar, specifically also in the Western press. Now, what is interesting about that is that what I think it showed, and this is not something that I only think, I think if you look at the Latour piece, you'll see that it's something that he writes about, that there is something in those Buddhas, something that inheres, a presence, a power that makes it a threat to other ways of understanding the world. Some things, something true, inhered in these Buddhas that was non-negotiable. And it's only through their destruction that that could be extinguished. In the same way that it's only through probably the destruction of the image that you can get rid of the power and the presence that inheres in the representational form that we see in the photograph of your loved one. So, I think we're coming to the end of this lecture, and I just want to ask you, do you think that mediation is then a bar to accessing the real? Or is mediation the only means by which we can access the real? Do you feel as if you've been here with me? Do you feel that there has been exchange? Or do you feel entirely absent? The point of this lecture is really to think about the ways in which our senses of authenticity, of immediacy, of present are reliant on modes of representation and mediation. And that we come to invest some of them with great authenticity and with great power, like the scientific image, but also the divine image, and others less so. And there is a fight that goes on between these different, let's call them aesthetics of persuasion after Birkenmeier, right? So both in terms of the debates around Brexit and about climate change, but also in the conflicts about what type of sacred image truly holds the divine. Is it the Buddha? Is it the Durga? Is it the feet of Jesus? Where does the true presence of the divine lie? This is an interesting question for us because it allows us to think about what it is that's so powerful in an image that it makes other people want to destroy it, but also what makes it so powerful that for us we come to invest particular types of representations, particular types of process of mediation with a higher level of truth than others. It also allows us to come back to the question that I asked right at the start, which is about your presence here or my presence there with you. So, social media. We started off by saying, well, they seem to be a diluted form of social interaction. But if we've now, at the end of this lecture, come to think about the ways in which all forms of presence, all forms of authenticity and all forms of ideas of the real are dependent on mediation, isn't the social media just another gradation of the forms of mediation that are required to produce social life to start out with? Think about this question, and I want you to try in the next hour to apply this together with Delwar Hussein, who's here very kindly to help you. Thank you, Delwar. I would like you to apply the key ideas of this lecture to the question of lecture capture. Now, you know that lecture capture is something that is animating students and staff, faculty, administrators within the university, and it's super controversial for all sorts of reasons. So I want you to start thinking about lecture capture through some of the tropes about mediation and presence and immediacy that we've been discussing, or rather I've been discussing during this lecture. And Delwar will put up some slides to give you some guidance. Maybe have a break right now, and then when you come back, have a conversation about lecture capture. What I'd really like you to do is at the end of that conversation, I want you as a group or as a set of groups to come up with a number of points about lecture capture that you think are really important. And try and think of it both from the perspective of students and lecturers. And then we can share that with anthropology, with the subject area, as we sort of enter into these conversations about the value of lecture capture, both to the teaching experience and to the learning experience. I'll be back with you next week, and I hope everything's going well with your assignments, with your sound recordings. I'll try and make some sound recordings here in Shonabadu, and I'll upload them for you, and you'll get a sense of the soundscape around here as you start to work on your own soundscape. It's been really fun and really weird talking to you like this, but I hope that next week we have a proper face-to-face interaction. Bye.